Father Ian Van Heusen here with Rob Agnelli, sorry. How do you pronounce it? Agnelli?
It's Agnelli. Well, a good Italian would say Agnelli, but it's been Americanized. So
there we go. So we're talking about virtue. Last time we introduced, he's from New York, where we actually kind of went to high school, a similar area. So getting in this week, we're talking about courage, fortitude. Before we get into the virtue, let's talk a little bit about movies. So I don't know about you. Do you like the Marvel movies much?
Sure, yeah.
Which one's been your favorite so far?
I like all the Captain America ones. Captain America's
my
guy.
Captain America?
Yeah, because he's actually trying to he gives this great model of manhood, right?
My sister has a theory that the patterns of the heroes are kind of like tied with personality temperaments. So she predicted, and she's right. My favorite was Iron Man. I like Iron Man. He's kind of flashy. He's kind of creative, flashy kind of type.
Wait, so are you a choleric? What are
you? Well, I would be. My temperament would be a little bit more See, I know the temperaments, the way we learned it in seminary. I'm trying to remember how. So there's sanguine. Well, what are they? There's
sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic.
Phlegmatic. Right. So I'm sanguine and choleric.
Okay.
Yeah. The extrovert.
Knowing them right is good for you to understand virtue, though, because some virtues are easier, right? So for a choleric, like courage is easier, right? A little bit.
Yeah.
Because they tend to be like external.
You take initiative. Yeah. No, that's actually an excellent point. I didn't think about going there, but so folks are knowing. So typically, and before the past 100 years, there was the classical idea of the four temperaments: two that are extroverted, two that are more introverted. That's kind of more modern language. And then but this was now with things like Myers-Briggs and things like that, it kind of expands upon that. But the four pretty much still holds true. I mean, normally the Myers-Briggs, the way it was explained to us, the Myers-Briggs and some of those other ones are some combinations of those four. But a lot of times you can see that one of them is dominant, or that there's like a middle ground between them. I'm
total choleric, like 100% choleric. I have nothing else mixed in. Nothing else.
You know what's funny? Among priests tend to be mostly introverted, and a lot of melancholic and a lot of phlegmatic. Very few cholerics. Cholerics are almost hardly in the priesthood at all.
Why is that? Why do you think that is?
We don't really know, but just when they tested our personalities, there were quite a few sanguines, but not mmany cholerics. Like in my whole seminary, 100+ guys, there was only 2 or 3 cholerics. Wow. Yeah, and then there's a small group of sanguine, but then most of them were melancholic and phlegmatic. But anyways, so
Captain America, you were saying about Captain America.
So there's something about these stories, right? We love this idea of conquering evil. It's the classic archetype of the hero story, right? I mean, did you play like warriors and stuff like that when you were a kid? Swords, guns?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Do you feel bad for kids these days? I mean, their parents there's a lot of parents who won't let their kids.
So I do have to tell you a story about this. So for confirmation, my 2 oldest boys so far have both made their confirmation. I give them a sword. Like a famous sword, and is
it a real sword?
Oh, it's a real sword. It's like a total heavy sword, like 20 pounds, right?
That's awesome.
And so my middle son just got confirmed last week, and he got his sword. He knew it was coming because his older brother got one. And they're literally, this is my 20-year-old son and my 15-year-old son out in the backyard, clashing swords. Like it doesn't go away, right? That never goes away. It's just awesome.
The swords can handle that?
These things are like real swords. So my older one has a Braveheart sword. Like,
gotcha.
That's like that big, And then the next one.
The broadsword, like a 2-handle?
Yeah, literally he's like, holding it with both hands. And then the next one down has one from The Hobbit. I forget the name of the sword. No, it's a long one. The long one from why am I drawing a blank on his name?
I like more like the samurai sword. I like the more agile kind of look.
Yeah, but isn't there something cool about holding a sword?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, like you're like, it doesn't matter how old you are. Like I'm picking it up as I'm giving it to him. I'm like, I kind of like the way this feels.
And this is why we often talk about spiritual warfare with the virtues and things like that. Because I love the line from Chesterton. I quote this all the time. Children don't have to be taught that dragons exist. They have to be taught that dragons can be defeated. I love that.
Yeah, isn't it beautiful? It's so true, right?
Yeah.
It's so true.
Exactly. So courage in a certain sense. So the breaking down for folks, for St. Thomas Aquinas, temperance regulates the lower passions, our kind of animal instincts. And then there's the animals have the higher passions as well. The higher passions are those that are for difficult tasks, overcoming difficult tasks, doing the arduous good and overcoming the arduous evil. And so regulating those higher emotions is the virtue of courage. And this doesn't just regulate fear, it also regulates, because remember always with the virtues, right? There's excess and deficiency. So you can have an excess of the emotion of courage. And he says there's the virtue of courage, the emotion. It's a little confusing, but so you can have an excess of the emotion of courage, or you can have a deficiency where you're ruled by fear. And then there's the other ones are hope. You can have excess of the emotion of hope, not the theological virtue. It's a little confusing.
Yeah.
So, it's funny what he says about hope, the emotion of hope. He says there are two categories of people that have hope in excess: drunkards and the young.
So it totally makes sense, right? It totally
it's
makes
kind of
sense.
funny. So anyways, it's pretty funny. So we have to teach our children, we have to teach ourselves, we have to discover in solitude how to overcome our negative emotions and our stronger emotions. These things that make us either heroes or cowards or somewhere in between.
Yeah, and this is, I think, really apropos for the time we live in, where we're gripped by fear, right?
Yeah.
And how, like in mass, right, we're being manipulated because of fear in some ways, right? And so, and how, like, what fear can do to us if we don't know how to moderate it, if we don't know how to. I mean, courage is not fearing, right? It's feeling the fear and doing it anyway, and then eventually you stop feeling the fear. Yeah. But yeah, I think if there was one, and some of that comes down to just, courage typically tends to be a masculine virtue, right?
Yeah.
And when we hear so much about toxic masculinity,
yeah,
courage is almost like made fun of a little bit, right? Like, as some of the virtues necessarily are mocked, but it's weird to have courage kind of mocked now.
Absolutely. I was kind of thinking about this. So I talked about this during the lockdown. Tim hasn't heard this in a while, but doesn't this put on a whole new light St. Francis of Assisi kissing a leper, right? So right now, some of these stories should trigger.
Yeah, this is a beautiful image.
Some of these images should trigger. I mean, leprosy was just as contagious as COVID-19, right? And it's a long, painful death. St. Damien of Malachi, whose feast we just celebrated a few days ago. Obviously, the people who are watching or listening, it'll be at a different time. These were people that were willing to forego their health for the sake of love, for the sake of the mission, right? And I asked people, would you kiss somebody with COVID-19? Or like, would you care for somebody who had COVID-19? The story I give during the lockdown.
Well,
right?
We isolate them. Like, that's the protocol. You take them and you isolate them who does that, right? Like,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is remember when you were growing up and they talk about how they'd isolate lepers, and you'd be like, oh, they were so cruel. Yeah. It was so cruel.
We're just doing the same thing now.
I know, we're doing the same thing now, right? I mean, it's fascinating. So recognizing that hierarchy of values, because that's the thing is like you could hypothetically, and I know there's different takes on this, you could take the view that safety protocols are needed, masks, all that social distancing, you can buy into all of that. But if you sat down, our Governor Cooper, or if you sat down a Democrat and said, should I leave somebody dying on the side of a street because I'm afraid of COVID, or should I help them? My hope would be, even the person who believes the most in the safety protocols would say, okay, in that case, COVID-19 is not the biggest deal, help the person out. Yeah. But when you're coming from a place of fear and self-preservation, it makes us like animals, that we only think of ourselves. Animals don't lay down their life necessarily for other people, but that's what our Lord calls us to do, right? Lay down your life for another. So you could believe all the safety protocols, but still need to recognize that you cannot be controlled by fear, right?
Yeah, it's funny because my wife had COVID, and I still slept in the bed beside her. Like, I was not going to leave her by her. Like, husband doesn't do that, right?
Yeah.
And there were people who thought I was genuinely nuts. Like, my boss was like, well, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, I promised to take care of her. Yeah. I have to take it. Like, I can't just leave her in a room by herself." And it really got me thinking about, like, in the end, I'm like, well, if I get COVID, like, I got COVID as an act of, like, out of an act of love. Like, what could be better? Like,
Yeah.
what, I mean, if it's going to get me, it's going to get me. At least I did it through an act of love, right? And love conquers all fear, right? In the end, right? And so, and that's what it really is, because it's not even a second thought, right? And that's the whole point of courage, right? Is you, it becomes so habitual that you just do it, right? You just do what needs to be done, and you may feel fear, you may not, but it's not the obstacle that it is, right?
Absolutely. And and like we said before, there's the excess and the deficiency as well. And so that's a really interesting dynamic, right? Because that's a great example of having a hierarchy of values. You value the love of your wife more than getting a disease or potentially dying of it. You would rather be with her and love her than leave her alone for the sake of preserving yourself. And that's, I often talk about with regulating the emotions and with regulating, I talked about a lot during the lockdown, a hierarchy of goods. Health, comfort, security, those are animal things, right? And those things, we need those. And actually, I would tie this in with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have our lower needs, our instinctual needs. And we do need to be attentive to those things. Then there's our relationships. And during the lockdown, I mean, people neglected their relationships. They didn't care for other people. They isolated themselves in ways. It's like, guys, we were made for relationships. You could believe all of it. I'm not saying, I've said this 100 times. I tried to be neutral in this, but on a very simple way, your relationships are important. You have to invest in those things. And then there's your salvation and the spiritual goods, which are the highest. And this is where Jesus gets into, and the saints, for the sake of higher goods, you have to be willing to sacrifice lower goods. And this is what courage helps you to realize to in a reasoned way.
Yeah, and I think it also helps too, just to also moderate, like you were saying, the extreme, right, rashness, right, like being rash, because some people's response to fear is to then turn around and be rash. And that's when, again, like that has made a mess of the last, year and a half, is also people's rash behavior, right? Where people, they're like, oh, look what they're doing. They just don't care at all. That's not the response, right? In the face of, like, you have to courageously step up and go the middle path of things, right?
Exactly. Good point. So getting into this, so the ideals of the saints, what are some of the stories? So there's St. Francis of Assisi, who would kiss lepers. There is St. Damien Malachine, who lived among the lepers. Do you have any other ones? Can you think of?
I'm trying to think of a good example of courage. There's obviously St. George, right? St. George, but really, like it's all the martyrs, right? Like the martyrs all, St. Ignatius of Antioch immediately comes to, like, just the beautiful, like, sending the letters ahead, like, this is my shot, please don't stop this. That's courage to go, well, this is what I believe in, this thing. And I think this is where it comes down to, right? Like, we have to, in our minds, have things we're willing to die for. Yeah. Like certain things that, like, you cross that line, I'm willing to die for that. And it goes back to what we talked about last time, was sometimes comfort causes me to lose sight of those things that I'm willing to die for, right? Like I'm willing to die for my wife, but comfort could cause me to think, maybe not here, right? And so, like, that's what the saints, like, really give me, like, as the vision. The martyrs are the example, but even just the courage of just, like, everyday stuff, right? Like just facing
your fears.
Yeah, facing your fears.
That's a great way to end this segment. So we were talking about courage. This is a great conversation, and stay tuned for more. We'll be getting into the other cardinal virtues and then moving on to the theological virtues. So thanks so much, Rob, for the conversation.